Kia ora, tēnā wō. My name's William Jennings. I've presented several times at Kīngitanga Day in the past. This time's a little bit different because I'm presenting someone else's work. Master's student of mine, Braden Bryant. Braden comes from Northland. He's studying Māori, French and linguistics with an emphasis on language policy. On top of that, he's lived in France. He's lived in Western France, in Brittany, so he's perfectly qualified to undertake the research. However, his partner was due to go into labour the day before yesterday, so I'm presenting Braden's work. He's got other things on his mind at the moment. We're going to be looking at this in three aspects. First of all, the background information, the decline, then the efforts to reverse the decline, to revitalise the language, and finally issues beyond just the language into culture and identity. Breton is spoken in the western peninsula of the western end of Brittany, part of France. You might think these days, you'd be right to think these days everyone in France speaks French, but historically that wasn't the case. It was a huge range of languages spoken in France up until probably the mid-20th century, when many of them started to fail. Since everyone's very keen on talking about flags at the moment, there are some exciting flags up there from some of those French regions. You've got to admit, if you've got a flag like that, that's Corsica. You don't mess with the Corsicans, they're very proud. So we've got some ideas for our referendum there. Breton is a Celtic language. It's very, very close to Welsh. In fact, Welsh people and Bretons can communicate without having to pass through English or French. Breton was spoken by the majority of people in the region until the late 1800s. And it was then that the French government brought in free and compulsory primary education throughout the country, which was a great step forward in literacy, obviously. But that education was only in French, which meant that kids all over the country speaking various regional languages, but not speaking French, ended up learning the language through their schooling. But of course, it had an effect on their native languages. It was very strictly French in the education system, so there were well-documented cases of punishments for speaking your native language, so the regional languages, not just in Brittany, but across France. And of course, you'll find some parallels with other places as well. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, the years in between the two world wars in particular were marked by a very strong shift away from regional languages in France towards the national language French. In the space of 3 generations, the regional languages all but disappeared. It went from the grandparents who spoke only that language to their children who were brought up in the regional language, who were brought up in Breton, but went to school in French. And then when there was a shift towards the cities, there was migration away from the countryside towards the cities, they ended up working in French as well. And that generation made the decision to bring up their children in French. At the time, they believed that it was, the Breton was the language of the past, French was the language of the future, it was the language of success, it would enable their children to succeed in life. So they made the conscious decision to switch. Consequence of that was that by the 1970s, it seemed that Breton was going to die out. But there was a cultural renaissance across many danger of becoming extinct. The Bretons were particularly inspired by cases in the Basque Country, in Wales, and in French Canada. But of course there were other places also concerned, other peoples concerned about the loss of their language. An association of Breton parents opened the first Diwan school. Diwan means seed or germinate or sprout in Breton. The first total immersion preschool in Breton opened in 1977. It led to many more. Today, there are, you see the emphasis on the preschool and the primary schools. There are 41 D1 schools, 6 middle schools, and 1 high school. It starts off as total immersion. As the kids go through the system, they get more and more French language, because when they get to the end of high school, they're required to sit their national exams in French. But at the preschool level, it's entirely in French, in Breton, sorry. So they're really working on the immersion. It wasn't straightforward for the parents who first set up these schools, because the French Constitution states quite clearly, right near the top, the language of the Republic is French. There are very important historical reasons for that, to do with the French Revolution and trying to unify the nation. But what it means is the French government isn't really that keen on funding immersion schools. So the parents started working on the state schools and the private schools. And in the mid-1980s, Breton, the various options of Breton began in those schools. Sometimes it was just a few hours a week, like 3 or 4 hours a week. So instead of learning Spanish or German, you might learn Breton. At other times, it was maybe 2 or 3 times that much. So there's a lot of variation in the number of hours offered in those schools. But the results look pretty impressive. Wouldn't you like to see a nice graph like that for the situation here? The top of the graph, the top line, that's the total. The red is the D1 schools. They've leveled off somewhat, but you can see that the state schools in green and the private schools in yellow there are lots and lots of children in Brittany now studying Breton, and it's going up quite sharply. So there's very positive growth there. They're putting a lot of money into it, and I'll mention that in a moment. However, there's obviously more to saving the language than just the schooling. A TV station was launched in 2001. It had a lot of Breton language content, but that declined fairly quickly for funding reasons. Since 2010, there's no Breton available on that channel. But if you like Murder, She Wrote or Columbo or other reruns from the 1970s and 1980s, that's the place to go. The internet, this Breton presence on the internet, and other minority languages are working on this as well, where you've got a YouTube channel in your particular language. The thing is, people are less inclined to watch it because they have to go and look for it. It's not the same as just sitting there flicking through the channels and and a channel in the regional language comes up. You actually have to go and look for it. There's a radio presence, but it's fairly small. It's like a few hours of community radio would be the equivalent. And in Western Brittany, you will see street signs in French and Breton as well. The efforts to reverse decline in Brittany have been, well, they thought they were going to be encouraged by a new article in the French Constitution, which basically recognised regional languages as a taonga. But again, the French government is more token recognition than actually putting money into it. However, France has been decentralising more and more since the 1990s. They've been sending more central government money to the regions, and it's really now the regions that are driving the efforts to save the local languages. And Breton is by far the strongest in this respect in France. So it's not the central government that's going to save those languages, it's now the regions. Another issue beyond the classroom and funding, the issues of identity. Bretons are French first, and the exception of very, very few people, they will identify first as French and then as Breton. And when they talk about being Breton, it refers to living in that region, rather than a strong attachment to the culture and a strong identification with the language. One of the reasons for that is that there are very few cultural spaces for the language. There are a few festivals. There are the occasional Breton festival. There are interceltic festivals as well. But the focus for Breton seems to be on the classroom. Now, that makes for very attractive looking graphs, as we've just seen. But that's not the whole story. Culturally in France, there's a greater separation between the home and the school. That could be a problem. The school is it has much more of an academic focus, even from lower levels. And that can be a problem when you're trying to get kids to take the language home with them, to involve their parents. Then there are issues of shame. Like a lot of regional languages in France, those languages were associated with peasants. And the speakers would still, the elderly speakers still describe feelings of shame. But they talk about, being embarrassed if their mothers would call out to the mother would call out to the kids dinner time, or call out in the regional language. Kids would feel embarrassed about this, and that shame still lingers. And there's one more issue, a big issue in a number of regional languages in France: the problem of dialects. Breton has 4 dialects. One of them is quite distinct. So if you're producing teaching resources or TV programs, what are you going to do? If you haven't got the funding to produce the resources in the different dialects, you have to compromise. And they've compromised. But the elders say, well, that's not Breton. And not only do you have to compromise, you have to modernize as well, because you have to invent new terms. If you're trying to teach 5-year-olds Breton, you have to talk about videos and YouTube and who knows what. That the elders, there are no words like that. So there's a gap. It's not just limited to Breton as well, but with the dialects on top of the modernisation, it does cause problems. Now, as I've been discussing these points, I'm sure you'll have recognised some similarities with the linguistic situation here. Te Reo Māori has a similar history of decline, 19th century, the schooling in the dominant language, punishments for speaking Māori, the switch from the 1930s, 1960s, the switch from Māori to English, enhanced by the move to the cities. And of course the revival attempts, they will seem a little familiar as well. Of course, you've got the D1 and Kohanga Reo starting at roughly the same time. Māori television starting at roughly the same time. Only that station has succeeded. But despite the similarities of history, we get different results. On the left, census figures up to 2006, people identifying as Māori. You can see a very impressive growth curve there. But look at the enrolments in best you could say it's stable, but we're really looking at gentle decline. You put those two together, it suggests that the percentage of the Māori speakers is declining, certainly for the future generations. Now, one thing Braden pointed out very strongly was differences in issues of identity. In particular, Te Reo Māori has a place. Breton doesn't have a place, doesn't have the equivalent of the marae, a place where not only is the language essential, it's exclusive. There's also the advantage here of having national status rather than regional status, which helps, for example, for the TV programming, the funding behind that. There's the fact that Kohanga Reo, of course, they started on marae initially, and the emphasis on whānau, on transmitting the language. And then outside the Māori community, across all primary schools now, you've got very positive attitudes towards Māori culture in the schools. Kapahaka, the Matariki, Māori Language Week, and so on. All of those things, great advantages. So there's a lot of positive connotations with the language here, particularly with new generations coming through. So we've got two very different pictures when you look at how the languages are faring. The conclusions for Breton: yes, there's lots of growth in the schools, but it just seems to be about the schools. There doesn't seem to be anything outside the community. Not even, really the emphasis on the families. So it's almost like they're teaching it as an academic subject. And that's causing serious issues for transmission of the language. Because if you want a language to survive, it has to be able to be transmitted, not just to the next generation, but to the one after that. And it doesn't look very good for Breton, despite that lovely figure, that lovely graph. There needs to be creation of some sort of cultural space where Breton has value. There's not a lot of that. Although it does help, that's Nolwenn Leroy up there, one of France's most popular singers. She won the first French Idol, I don't know, about 10 or 15 years ago. She's very proudly Breton. One of her albums was called Breton. She doesn't speak the language, but she promotes it, and she's a positive role model for it. Because traditionally Breton singers are old sort of hippie-looking guys strumming a guitar or a harp. Now that's not going to appeal to 10-year-olds. So you need a certain youthful vitality portrayed in the culture as well. Now Braden's conclusions for the situation here. Transmission to the next generation is not assured. The numbers, those, because it all starts with the Kohanga Reo, really, and those numbers are not brilliant. He talks about the possibility that maybe there's a little bit of complacency with the enhanced visibility of Te Reo Māori. That maybe people are thinking, well, there's been a lot of work done with the cultural regeneration. Look at things like Te Matatini now. It's really, really big. That sort of thing's been achieved, but what about the education? And one final point, normalisation. It's fine on the marae, but what about outside in the community? What about in everyday situations? I've been on this campus for a good few years now. In between lectures, it's a pretty busy place when you're walking backwards and forwards on those paths, going from one class to another. In all the years I've been here, I've only twice heard people speaking Māori in that context. You hear it on the marae, you hear it at Pōwhiri, but this issue of normalisation, everyday conversational language, outside a Māori cultural context, if you like, just the everyday situation, the language needs to be normalised to enhance its chances of continuation of transmission to future generations. Kia ora. That's all for me.
Couple of minutes for questions. Do we have any questions? We've got one off the back here.
Hi. Have they, in Brittany, have they ever bothered looking at the other Brittonic languages? And, for example, in Wales, they have the Eisteddfodau for revitalising things. And in some ways, some of those practices in Wales also could help in New Zealand, such as bilingual signage.
Yeah, they have. There's a lot of cooperation between the Celtic revival movements because they're all working for the same sort of goal. And I know Brittany and Wales are very close in that respect. So I don't know a whole lot about the cooperation between the two, but they simply must have worked. I mean, they meet every year at the Inter-Celtic Festival, so there must be a lot of sharing of information.
Yeah, I was just wondering if in Brittany they thought of producing their own similar cultural festivals like the Eisteddfodau.
They do have the Fest-Noz, but again, it's limited. It's not. It's kind of, I don't know. It's a temporary thing.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Any others?
Oh, just wondering, William, I'd assumed that before Julius Caesar arrived to incorporate France in the Roman Empire, the locals would have spoken languages similar to Breton, in which case does Breton not have some sort of value as an ancestral language?
Breton is treated as different because, they spoke Gaulish, basically. Julius Caesar came along. The Romans occupied Gaul for 5 centuries, and gradually the language of the Gauls became the ancestor of French. And then in about the 6th or 7th century, when all of the Vikings and so on moved into England, refugees fled from southwestern England into Brittany. And that's where Breton comes from. It's Cornish, if you know of the Cornish language. So they were refugees, that's an interesting word. We call them refugees or migrants. But they were basically refugees or migrants, or whatever the term is, fleeing persecution and moving across the Channel. That's why Brittany and Great Britain, that's why they have the same similar sounding name. So there's a different history, and then Brittany was an independent kingdom for 1,000 years afterwards, before it became assimilated into the French kingdom.
One more over here.
Kia ora tēnā koe, ki tō kaupapa I koro tia mai tēnei ata. I completely agree with you. Thank you very much for your presentation. The normalisation is essential, that's what I'm talking about. How important is it to you for the Prime Minister of Aotearoa to be fluent in Te Reo Māori?
I think, as a language teacher, I think it's important for people to speak at least one foreign language, and quite frankly, the more the merrier, because it gives you a different perspective on things. So yes, it'd be nice to have someone who can speak more than one language running things. Yeah.
Kia ora.
We got time for one more?
My interest in this comes from Cornish. The Cornish are currently chasing, under the European Parliament, to be a special region that contains all the language and culture. Are Britain people trying the same thing?
I think what they're using, and a lot of other places in Europe are trying it, is that with the European Union, plus a trend towards devolution, the regions are getting more and more strength, more and more power. So it's almost like they're trying to go around the nations, go around the national things. So you've got places, Catalonia in Spain, where they're trying to say, or the Basque country, where yes, they happen to be part of Spain, but actually they're just a region in Europe. The Bretons have been trying this, yes. The Corsicans, even more so. As you can see from that flag, you don't mess with them. So.
Well, kia ora, William.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. As a geographer, I found it really interesting about how place plays an important role in strengthening languages, and Te Reo and Breton